Welcome to our video, A Brief History of Hominid Evolution, Why We Are the Way We Are. In this video, we're going to be covering some of the basic concepts of evolution and how evolution has played a role in developing our physiology in a specific way. And the purpose of this is to lay a foundation to better understand the philosophy and the theory behind this evolutionary biomechanics and the human movement method. And we're going to talk about this as we move along. But this is the first video because it plays such a vital role in laying the foundation for everything that comes after it. So let's get into it. So first we're going to talk about the law of energy transfer and the first law of thermodynamics. So thermodynamics, really important concept when it comes to evolution, and you're about to find out why. So the first law, energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be transmitted, it can only be transformed. So the 10% rule of energy transfer states that each level of an ecosystem only gives 10% of its energy to the level above it. This law explains much of the structural dynamics of an ecosystem, including why there are more organisms at the bottom of the ecosystem pyramid than at the top. So we're going to take a little pause there for a second. So what that ultimately means is you're just going to see a lot more organisms that feed on primary energy source, which in this particular case, the primary energy source is actually the sun, and then the primary producers are plants, basically, that are converting sun energy into storable energy, plant energy, that is then consumed by creatures in order to get, unfortunately, 1% of that energy. 10% of that energy. So in this particular case, if, we'll say, some any plant produces 100% of the energy that's going to be in an ecosystem, that means the next critter that comes along and eats that plant to gain energy is only going to get 10% of the energy from the 100% of energy stored by the plant. And then let's say that that critter was an insect, and then that insect is then consumed by a creature above it. That creature is only going to get 1% of the original 100%, and so on and so forth. So then the next creature comes along and eats it. That's 0.1% of the original source, and then all the way up to apex predators, 0.01%. Now, this is really interesting because, for example, we as humans can eat plants, and we're able to get vitamins and minerals out of plants. And if the plant produces carbohydrates or fats or proteins that we are able to break down, we can get energy from those things. But say an herbivore of some kind comes along and eats the same plant, and they have the capacity to break cellulose down into energy. Well, they're going to get a lot more energy out of that plant than we can, because we can only get the starches out of it, which, you know, we have successfully domesticated a large number of plants to produce large amounts of those starches, but that didn't exist pre-civilization. So, you know, when we were just out in the wild hunting and gathering and not cultivating domestic plants, the amount of energy that we were getting from plants, although really important and actually a very large amount of our diet, was not coming from necessarily calorically dense sources. So like a tuber of some kind would be very calorically dense versus you know, if you were eating some kind of grass, which you really can't digest. So anyway, the point is that once all of these things die, along come the decomposers and recycle those nutrients back into the system, and all the other energy that we don't absorb is lost as heat energy, which is a really important point, because, and we'll talk more about how heat energy is really important when it comes to biological function later on. I propose that the more complex an organism is, the more energy it will need. So that also means the larger the organism is, the more energy it'll need. Therefore, efficiency is incentivized with greater complexity. So the more complex a creature is, the more efficient it needs to be, and the more effective method of acquiring energy it needs. So one of two things can happen. So if I'm in an environment that is abundant with energy, then efficiency is going to benefit me because I can grow big and strong. If I am in an environment that is not abundant with energy, in fact, energy sources are scarce, well, efficiency is going to be really, really important at that point. Efficiency from the perspective of biological function, if there's a lot of energy, I can grow big and strong. If I have an effective method for acquiring energy that's efficient, this is external efficiency, meaning that even though energy is scarce, I can acquire a fair amount of it by gathering more material effectively. In both cases, each one of those is going to drive different evolutionary factors. So internal biological efficiency versus external mechanical efficiency. Both are really important in different circumstances and are going to become incentivized in different circumstances. Over time, the environment may change, and an organism will have to develop both of these. And you see that throughout the course, this very, very long process of evolution. So evolution and the second law of thermodynamics is really important. The second law of thermodynamics states that the state of entropy of the entire universe as an isolated system will always increase over time. So that means entropy will increase over time. The second law also states that the changes in the entropy in the universe can never be negative. It's really important. So we can't actually lose anything in the universe. It can only transmute. So let's talk about what entropy is. Entropy is the degradation of the matter and energy in the universe to the ultimate state of an inert uniformity, or entropy, is the general trend of the universe toward death and discord or chaos. So the universe is always decaying, the universe is always falling apart, the universe is always moving toward chaos. Because in the beginning, it was all coalesced in one place. Well, that's not very chaotic. It's all organized in one singular place. If the Big Bang theory is correct, then Big Bang happens, and now there's all this diversity. And we also know that the universe is constantly expanding. So things are actually becoming less and less organized all the time. So Darwin suggested that a mechanism for evolution, natural selection, in which the heritable traits that help an organism survive and reproduce become the more common in a population over time. So this is a really important statement. At no point did Darwin say survival of the fittest. So that's fun fact number one. What he's saying is that nature is going to favor the traits that allow for reproduction, so that way the population becomes more and more full of these specific traits, because they are going to be more likely effective and efficient at gathering energy. They'll live longer lives, therefore they will most likely propagate more. Effective and efficient are significantly more important than bigger, stronger, faster. Now, is bigger, stronger, faster more effective and efficient? Maybe, maybe not. We're going to look at a couple of cases where it may not have been. And it's important to understand that the phrase survival of the fittest is often incorrectly attributed to Darwin. In fact, it was coined by the philosopher Herbert Spencer in response to the reading of The Origin of Species 5 years after the first edition was published. So Literally, that statement was never said until 5 years after Darwin published his first work. Fun fact number 2. Herbert Spencer was a social Darwinist, aka a racist, sexist, ableist eugenicist trying to justify beliefs with pseudoscience. Basically, the argument was, well, we as the prevailing white people have what we have because we are the fittest, aka the strongest, the smartest, the fastest, and the proof of that is that we have what we have and that we can take it from other people. So we have what we have, we deserve what we have because we have it and because we can take it. That's basically the argument, and that has nothing to do with evolution. In fact, it's just using pseudoscience to justify really awful behaviors that we're still trying to deal with today. So the takeaway here is it is not the biggest, the fastest, and the strongest that is best suited to pass on genes, but instead the most efficient biological system. The most efficient system wins because entropy is going to break down over time. Entropy is going to make sure that energy is lost over time. So the most effective and efficient system is going to ultimately lower that state of entropy for the organism. That's what you're seeing here. Basically, order and information over time. So entropy is going to go down the higher evolution goes. So now we're going to look at a human being and their caloric needs, broken down by organs. And the reason I chose to do this is because I need to point out that your brain eats about 17% of all of the energy that you consume. So just literally being alive, your brain takes up 17% of everything you consume. After that, your heart eats about 8% of it. For some reason, your liver eats about 19% of it. Kidneys, 7%. Even your fat takes about 3% of the calories you consume. Your muscle system, 20%. Digestion, 10%. And everything else outside of that is 16%. So it's really important to understand that between your muscles, your heart, and your brain, that's an enormous amount of the calories that you eat. And what's crazy is your brain almost uses the same amount of energy that your muscles use, just to keep you breathing and talking. So you have to understand that the human brain is calorically a giant hog, and it's a huge energy suck on the body. And a lot of the calories that we eat go into it. So now we're going to take a look at one of our closer relatives in the hominid family, and that's the Neanderthals. We actually existed side by side with them for a period of time, and the myths you've been told about them are just not true. Although shorter in stature, Neanderthals were more robust, powerful, and required significantly more energy than us. The average Neanderthal needed about 3,200 calories per day. It's believed a Neanderthal woman could easily bench over 300 pounds without a gym membership. They could throw up to 20 meters, that's around 60 feet accurately. And I don't know if you've seen the spears that they've found at Neanderthal campsites, but they're not small. If they threw one of these at you, it would not only penetrate your body, but probably knock you over because they were fairly large. Neanderthals were expert sprinters with a limited long-range running ability. They couldn't run the way we do because their pelvises were different. They were extremely inefficient at long distances, but at short distances, they would have blown us out of the water in a foot race. Neanderthals hunted at short range and used speed and power to acquire food. So you have to understand that it is likely that they used tools. We know that for an absolute fact. They hunted with weapons. We know that for a fact. But it's highly likely that they would still get in really close to very large animals. And they've been found, their bodies have been found just absolutely mangled from the fact that they most likely were getting in hand-to-hand conflicts with large creatures or each other, or potentially packs of animals. Who knows? They also gathered calorically dense foods like nuts, fruits, shellfish, pulses, and tubers, much like we did. And they also processed and cooked their food. So we know that they cooked. So that means that they were they were very similar to us. Massive broad shoulders are indicated by their scapular breadth, and that is about 8% larger than the modern human. They were also shorter than us. Muscle attachments for the pectorals were enormous, up to twice the size of today's average. Neanderthals had shorter, wider upper arms, and the bones in their forearms were bowed from muscles. Literally, the muscles were so strong in their forearms that the bones bowed in development, which means that they had a grip strength that if they got their hands on you, they'd probably break your bones. They had massive quadriceps that specialized in explosive power and side-to-side lateral movement. This is one of the reasons that I believe that they most likely were hunting at close ranges, was because they probably got into positions where they were cornering animals and outmaneuvering them in lateral and medial movement, which is wild if you think about it. Enormously powerful. So early humans, us, we were taller, longer than our nearest competitor. So Neanderthals were basically our nearest competitor with a more advanced fascial network. Our fascial system in early humans and modern humans was significantly more efficient than Neanderthals. Although weaker, early humans could jog, run, climb, crawl, swim, throw significantly better. This allowed for a more diverse diet. So this might sound like a strange thing to say, but if a human being, a modern human and an ancient human, could swim, climb, crawl, and throw at very long ranges, very, very accurately, particularly in groups, it's likely that humans actually were gathering things like honey, shellfish, spearfishing in lakes and rivers, and hunting small game with significantly greater success and a lot less exposure to injury and death. There's all these pictures from when I was a kid of like ancient man with spears, like going after these mastodons and stuff. And the truth is, one, they would have never gotten that close if they didn't have to. And two, why work that hard and go through that much danger for a large food source when you could hunt small and medium-sized game that was not a danger to you because your capacity for long-range throwing was significantly better and more accurate. Also, it's important to understand that because we could jog long distances very, very efficiently, and there's a great book about this called Born to Run, there's some fundamental assumptions made that I just don't agree with, like the fact that humans didn't throw a spear for the first 200,000 years that they were on the planet. That's been utterly disproven. But outside that, there's some really interesting arguments about chasing animals to exhaustion. And also, I tend to think that we were able to gather at greater distances with more efficiency because our gait cycle was more efficient. It's also believed that sling throwing dates back as far as the late Paleolithic era, that's 50,000 to 12,000 years ago, but is difficult to confirm because slings are biodegradable. They were often made from fibrous materials or leather. And also, it would be hard to distinguish the ammo for a sling because it would just be a round rock, as opposed to finding something that's been constructed and very clear like a spear. Early records of throwing spears predate Homo sapiens and go back almost 500,000 years. So the knowing man, our ancient ancestors, go back about 130,000 years to present. They're found worldwide. Highly crafted tools, complex social organization, omnivorous diet. The Cro-Magnon man is an early Homo sapien that lived in Western Europe during the late Ice Age. Now, it's also important to understand that there were also Denisovans, and there were also an early hominin called Heidelbergensis. These were all competitors. There were lots of different human species that existed. We are simply the one that's left, and it's very likely that there are chunks of our DNA that belong to other hominids and hominins, because there was crossbreeding that occurred. We know that at least with Neanderthals. And there's a belief, I don't know how much of this holds water, but there's a belief that, if a Neanderthal and a human created a child, that if the child was male, they were likely sterile, but if the child was female, they were able to pass on the Neanderthal DNA, and that's why a lot of Europeans today, which we're learning through genetic testing, have around 2 to 5% Neanderthal DNA. Some higher than that, some lower. So, but you do see it all over the place. It's just highest concentration in the European area. I believe. I could be wrong. If I'm wrong, let me know. But the other thing to understand too is that this is a really interesting statement. This is a really interesting statement here where it says highly crafted tools. Recent research has found that Neanderthals actually probably used epoxy to put together multiple part tools. So there's a lot of argument that we're beginning to find out that they were probably just as smart as we are in a lot of different ways. So why are we here in Neanderthals art? In a one-to-one fight or even a war, Neanderthals may have had the advantage. It is more than likely the main contributing factor was modern humans could move further, faster, and gather more energy with less expenditure than Neanderthals. We simply consumed all the food faster because we were able to gather more than we needed and save it. They had to eat twice as much as us in an environment where we weren't cultivating food, we were hunting and gathering it. And there's this argument that says Neanderthals were mainly carnivorous. I don't know how true that is because they have found that they processed vegetable-based foods, which we went over earlier. So it's important to note that both species could talk. Both species had the ability to organize and work together. Both species existed next to each other and even interbred, producing offspring that could reproduce. Both species had some form of spirituality and buried their dead. Both species took care of their ill and injured, and we even know that Neanderthals worked with pigment and created early art. So, in a face-to-face war, they would absolutely destroy us. It's also important, and I don't think I've put this in a slide anywhere, to note that almost everyone alive today is, at least in the European area, I'm not sure if this is true worldwide, but came down to about 40 people. The official story says that there was a plague that nearly wiped out humanity. There was a mass extinction, and almost all of us are descendants of like maybe 2 or 3 families, about 40 people, that were left. So if we came close to extinction at the same time that Neanderthals were running around next to us, how did we manage to survive and they didn't when they were also around twice as long, if not longer than us? So what does this have to do with fitness and training? That's a great question. So the thesis here is that humans evolved to prioritize dynamic, moderate effort, moving with a high degree of skill over raw power. This led to the greatest advantage and the longest lifespan to mate, learn, and pass on knowledge and genes. Therefore, our training should reflect this for the highest degree of benefit lifelong. So in this case, our prioritized movements should be standing, walking, jogging, running, throwing, climbing, crawling, carrying, pushing, and pulling, and possibly swimming. Swimming might be secondary, and I'll talk about that at another time. As opposed to the current training paradigm that basically says humans are supposed to squat, hinge, push, pull, twist, plank, and run. I'm going to fundamentally make the argument that these movements are constructs based on the training equipment that we have had up to current, and that we are locked in this paradigm unnecessarily, and that we need to transition our paradigm from this to this. That's my argument. So let's look at standing. The basis for all movement, it consists of equal tension in the front to back on both sides. It is not a static position, but a constantly being adjusted position. So this is called perturbation. It has a very low caloric cost, a very high degree of adaptability, and prioritizes head over foot positioning. So perturbation is the process by which you are constantly adjusting your body in space. The human body is never in a static position. It just appears to be in a static position. If you've ever seen somebody that's had a head injury or neurological damage of any kind, or they're really inebriated, the perturbation becomes really obvious because they can't hold their balance without visibly being unstable. They wobble around. That is always happening on a micro level. If you want to experience it, pause this, stand up, close your eyes, and just try to stand as still as possible in a relatively comfortable position, and you will feel that you are consistently adjusting your posture on very, very small level. So next we're looking at walking, the next prioritized movement. Highly efficient. Walking is super efficient. It relies mostly on the fascial network for the recycling of energy. We're going to talk more about that in another video. Basically, the body uses the myofascial meridians and lines to absorb ground force when the foot falls and recycle it back into the system, kind of like a soft tissue flywheel that allows us to have the greatest degree of efficiency in order to propel ourselves. It uses primarily the fat oxidation energy system and aerobic systems. It has a very low level of joint shear. Shear is the enemy of health, joint health, and a very low level of compression, the other enemy of joint health, and actually can be restorative. If your biomechanics are good while walking, this can help to hydrate tissue throughout your body, not only in your legs, but also in your spine, throughout your torso, in your arms, and even your neck. If everything's working the way that it should. It's really, really important. We're going to talk more about gait cycles later, but just kind of bear this in mind. Jogging and running, extremely efficient compared to quadrupeds. It utilizes the fascial network for shock absorption and energy recycling. So you can see here on the right that there are two different methodologies in walking and running. So there's something called the stance phase and the swing phase. The stance phase is the leg that you transfer your weight over, and the swing phase is the leg that swings through at the time. In walking, you're always oscillating between stance and swing, where when running, you're actually oscillating between stance, float, and swing. And actually, not even involved in this is also the ground force touchdown. So at the end of the float phase, the foot hits the ground. When that foot hits the ground, there's energy transmitted into the body that the body then coils up on and then springs off of during the swing phase, entering the next float phase as the opposing leg transfers through the stance phase. When you're in the float phase, you're not really supporting your weight. You are temporarily buoyant. And so that's really important for understanding how that shock wave moving through the body is actually recycled by the soft tissue system, creating a very, very efficient gait cycle. In walking, it's a shorter swing stride. Sorry, in running, it's a shorter swing stride than a walk, but the overall distance you're covering is greater because of the float phase. And I've already talked about utilizing rebound force for energy conservation. It prioritizes head over foot mechanics. It has a very low level of shearing force if done properly, and it has a very low level of joint compression if done properly, because the rebound effect and the float actually decompresses the joints if you're doing it right. This high level shock absorption actually helps to hydrate the fascia in the body. And it can utilize multiple energy systems. So anything from the ATP system to the glycolytic system to the fat oxidation system, and of course the cardiovascular system. So throwing, the next evolutionarily prioritized movement. It's an efficient generation of power by using the fascial network as a rubber band to store and utilize full body force into a concentrated area. So if you look at this real close, you can see there are actually gait dynamics that are involved in a throw. So there's a swing phase of the leg, there's a touchdown, a stance phase, but then what's happening is instead of this leg swinging through, the energy is transferred across the body from the adductor through the rectus abdominis up through the pectorals and then in through the arm, and instead of the leg swinging, the arm swings and generates a throw. It's believed that the main component in the development of human consciousness was the ability to throw. And the basic idea here is that if I see an object, I know where the object's going in space, I have to mentally predict the future to know where to interrupt the object with the thing that I'm throwing. So a rabbit is running across my vision. I see it at point A. The rabbit is going to point C, I believe, I predict momentarily. So I'm going to throw somewhere in between there a point B. So A is on one side, C is on the other side, but my point of interruption will be point B, and I have to calculate all the math to make that happen in my head. So there's a belief that this ability in human history, not necessarily Homo sapien, but all hominin and hominid history, is the beginning of the development of consciousness because we are able to see briefly into the future and reflect on what happened to gain more skill so we can also briefly move into the past. Mainly this happens in explosive and short bursts. Movement using easily replenishable energy sources, meaning the ATP system. So, which happens in bursts and then replenishes fairly quickly. This can be developed into the martial skill of striking. So I believe that punching, kicking, and general striking, also weaponized striking, is an extension of throwing. Particularly if you get into the evolution of weaponized combat, particularly mid-range combat like swords, which is, although kind of all over our mythos, not really that common historically. If you had a choice between a spear and a sword, you probably chose the spear initially until it broke, and then you went to the sword, and then when that broke, you went to the knife, and then when that broke, you started hand-to-hand fighting. So it was about a diminishment of range. Thrusting, arcing, swinging, all of that is an extension of throwing. Next, we're going to look at climbing. Not as efficient for Homo sapiens, but necessary for our postural evolution in our lifetimes as well as in our evolutionary history. What I mean by that is you had to learn to crawl before you learned to walk. At least most of us did. In fact, we know that if a child did not crawl, there's some developmental issues that go along with that involving language development. It utilizes all three spinal movement capacities at once, which is lateral, anterior, and posterior, and rotation. So I can side bend, I can do flexion, extension, and I can do rotation. And when crawling, you kind of use all of those. It provides options for diverse food sources, aka climbing trees to get fruits, nuts, honey, that type of thing, which are, you have to remember, particularly tropical fruits and honey are our first access to really simple sugars that are going to be quickly absorbed into the body. Could enhance hunting and gathering, is known for developing cross-hemispheric communication in the brain, which plays a big role in critical thinking and language development. It's linked, yeah, I just said that. Takes axial force off of the spine, which is great. It decompresses joints when hanging passively. Unfortunately, you can also dislocate joints if the proper angles of force are applied. Can be developed into the martial skill of grappling. It's really interesting. I read an article that said for humans, our bodies prioritize descending rather than ascending because we were more likely to die descending, falling out of the tree, than ascending. Um, so it's an interesting concept. So you have to understand that climbing would probably, you would see the adaptive nature of those movements come out in ground fighting and standing wrestling type of movements. When you combine the two, you get throwing like judo, um, or like freestyle wrestling or pankration. So you get more of that. Crawling, not as efficient for Homo sapiens, but necessary for our postural evolution in our lifetime as well as in our history. Again, we do it as children. Um, it helps us develop our minds, and it's really important for climbing and crawling are really, frankly, mechanically speaking, very, very similar. You could say that climbing actually is an adapted version of crawling. You could make that argument. So they share a lot of the same qualities. It utilizes all three spinal movement capacities at once. It can enhance hunting and gathering. Again, crawling puts us in a position where we can hide below grass for camouflage. Same thing with climbing. You always see, again, these crazy movies where, people are going head to head with these large, dangerous animals. It is much more likely that humans would climb trees and sit there with pointy objects or large rocks and simply wait for the game to show up where there's a food source and then kill it. Much less dangerous, much more effective, and I'm not running around the woods burning calories trying to acquire them. I want to find a place where I can either lay low or high, where I'm not at the eye level of my prey, and I'm going to have the most effective method of killing it so that way I can get the most calories. You're not going to be running around in the woods hunting things by stalking them. It's just not likely. Chances are you're going to put yourself on a path where they go because they leave tracks, and you're going to wait because it takes the least amount of energy. Again, it's known to develop cross-hemispheric communication in the brain, is linked to development of language ability, takes axial force off of the spine, compression on joints when misaligned. So if you're crawling around on the ground and you're not aligned properly and you're not used to it and you don't have good biomechanics, it's going to put a lot of compression on your joints. Can cause irritation in joints if overused, can be developed into the skill of swimming, can also be developed into the martial skill of grappling. So there you go. Now we're going to look at carrying, pushing, and pulling. So this is rather specific to humans. And, when you talk about hunter-gatherer, well, in both cases, you had to carry stuff. So whether I was hunting game or I was gathering food, I needed to be able to carry it back to my lair and my tribe, basically. It's important to understand that this is really, really natural for humans. It's one of the benefits of being bipedal is that we can carry, which means we can go out, hunt or gather a thing, consume calories on site, and then, this is probably less true with hunting, but it's definitely true with gathering, I can consume calories on site and then carry more than I needed back to either be saved or shared. And that really matters. It requires control in all planes of motion. It requires all energy systems. If you've ever pushed or pulled a sled, you know what I'm talking about. It's used for hunting and gathering. It's used for construction. It can be used for caregiving. If you've ever had to caregive for somebody and you've ever had to move them around, push them, pull them, carry them, it's really important. It axially can load the spine and requires mechanics of nearly all previous profiles. So you have to understand carrying, pushing, and pulling requires us to mimic different elements of everything I've already mentioned, including specialized components for this. And there can be, because of the axial load, a high degree of compression on the joints. And when I'm talking about joints, I'm very much talking about the spine. So I hope this has been helpful. This lays the foundation for a conversation that we're going to have moving forward. We'll continue in further videos when we go over a quick history of physical culture, principles of modern training, the 5-part lens, evolutionary biomechanics and training, and the human movement method. The goal is that in the next video, which is a quick history of physical culture, we are going to talk about how humans have trained throughout modern history, societal history, and how in the last 150 years or so, we have developed the fitness industry and how that industry has developed our practices for specific reasons in very specific ways. So stay tuned for that one. The principles of modern training, we're going to go over the basics that everybody should know, which is, concepts like progressive overload, energy system, heart rate and energy system management, and training for longevity and well-being. In the 5-part lens, we're going to talk about combining 5 different lenses and schools of thought of training and human movement. And when we put them all together, their synergistic effect is ultimately going to lead to the evolutionary biomechanics in training, also known as the human movement method, which I'm going to define in the 5th video. So thank you for watching. Please continue on. If you would like more information on many of the topics already listed, you're going to find a number of links in the descriptions, and you can go and explore those links either to gather more information and to learn more about this, and then come back and watch future videos, or you can watch all of these videos and then come back and rewatch those to learn more. None of this really, it's intended to move in a linear method, from video to video, but you can really watch it in any order because we all have different learning styles. So thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.